My name is Leslie Powell. I'm the host of the relatively new, we now have been going for almost a year, ICPA Forum. That's the International Comparative Policy Analysis Society that's affiliated with the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis. This series entitled Book Talks. The intent of the series is to be more conversational and more like a podcast interview rather than a conventional academic presentation. And we are looking for books, obviously, that are exploring key issues in comparative policy analysis, and looking at the issues that are raised by those respective research endeavors and their implications for the broader research and academic work going on in comparative public policy. Toward the end of this discussion, if we have a few minutes, we'll open it up for a Q&A if any of the audience members want to raise some questions with our guest. Speaking of which, today I'm honored to have the editor, though as I will explain in a moment, almost the author of a relatively recent book, 2024, Women's Empowerment and Public Policy in the Arab Gulf States, Exploring Challenges and Opportunities. This was published by Springer in 2024, and it's open access if people are interested. The editor, quasi-author, is Dr. Rabia Naguib, who's an associate professor in the School of Economics, Administration, and Public Policy at the Doha Institute of Graduate Studies in Doha, Qatar. Before we plunge into the book, I just want to, share our hopes that things go well for our friends and colleagues in Doha and Qatar, given the current conflicts in the region. I understand that some of the institutions, even the Doha Institute, have had to go online. Some colleagues have not been able to get back because airspace was closed. So people are facing substantial issues there. Don't want to minimize those. So it's particularly gracious of Dr. Rabia to come online with us under these kinds of circumstances. So we all wish you well, and we hope that this conflict will be resolved in an acceptable fashion in the near future. So before we jump in, I wanted to make a couple of sort of editorial observations of my own about the book. As I mentioned already, one of the unusual aspects is the degree to which Dr. Rabia, even though she's an editor, is actually almost a author or co-author, with all due deference to your colleagues and co-authors in the book. Of the 9 chapters in the book, you're the sole author of 3 and the co-author of 3. So this positions you particularly well, I think, to speak to the themes and contents of the book as a whole. The other aspect of the book that I think is important to bring out, and we'll explore this to some extent in the discussion, is that while the book is about I think a relatively common preoccupation in Western public policy analysis, and that's women's empowerment and gender issues, it comes at this from a distinctive regional as well as an epistemological perspective. It's about women's empowerment in the Arab Gulf states. And from a non-Western, I think it's fair to say non-Western perspective, one that resonates or aligns more with the worldviews that are anchored in that particular region. For example, you have a very powerful quote from the Quran as a frontispiece for the book, and I'll quote this. So their Lord responded to them, "Indeed, I will never cause to be lost the work of any doer among you, whether male or female. You are one of another." And then the injunction following this quote from the Quran is to fellow seekers of balance, endeavoring to find and follow a middle path while avoiding the drawbacks of both excess and deficiency. So having a religious quote from a holy book like this at the head of a policy text would be, to put it mildly, somewhat unusual for a typical publication in Western public policy. And then in addition to that, you have a very powerful epilogue where you make a powerful statement about the inspiration of Islamic principles as a guide to the empowerment of women and gender relations in an Arab and an Islamic context, but I think more broadly as well. So I think our viewers or people that are listening to this podcast need to understand that this book is, while it has a focus on an issue that I think is fairly broadly accepted as a key one, an important one in Western policy analysis, comes at it from a very different perspective. So with those sort of framing comments at the outset. Let's jump in. Could you outline first for the our audience, or for those not familiar with the region, some of the specific features of the Arab Gulf states, since that's mostly the geographical focus of the book? What's different, distinctive? How should we understand this regional context before we get into the content of the book?
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Leslie, for this presentation. Thank you very much for having me and for offering this opportunity to engage in this conversation and to talk about the book. But let me first, before answering, give some background and clarification about the embryonic phases and stages of development of the book that will clarify, maybe if there is like some what you started with, like that would
Okay.
explain why, for example, I started with the Quranic verse and why specifically the Islamic worldview and why Qatar and the GCC. So this book is a product and one of the deliverables of competitive QNRF grants, which is Qatar National Research Fund, over like $500,000. It's about the role of public sector in empowering women in Qatar and the GCC. So that explains why I authored and co-authored and most of the chapters, and why the focus is on the GCC and Qatar. So that's explained as first myth. And then I would like to draw the attention to the foreword of the book, kindly written by I think a common acquaintance, who is a high profile and very impactful role model in Qatar and the region, Her Excellency Lulwa Al Khatir, who is currently the Minister of Education and Higher Education in Qatar. She wrote, and I quote, "When my dear colleague Dr. Rabia Naguib first spoke to me about the idea of the book, deep inside I had hoped for three things. For the book to avoid being a piece of Western activism, for the book to avoid being a diplomatic government report, and finally, for the book to actually look at the women's public policy nexus without being completely sucked into politicization." So this last point in particular had been always a concern to me whenever the term public policy is combined with anything that has to do with the Arab region at large, given the fact that the demarcation between political analysis and policy analysis is most of the time non-existent. After getting the chance to take a glimpse at the book through the chapters executive summary, I was happy to see that there has been some sort of a telepathy with the authors who seemed keen to carve out a new approach to the topic. So I think that sets the tone and the stage for the book. And so the initial plan for the book, as for any academic endeavor, is to start with the systematic literature review, which I did with the help of a couple of research assistants, given the grant I had. However, this extensive exercise allowed me to come up with two important observations that influenced the structure of the book and the approach adopted towards this topic. So as you can see, there's no literature review, there's no systematic literature review in the book because of this. So the first observation was a semantic atrophy, which was so clear, after doing all this, reading this literature, which refers to an overuse, to the loss of meaning of the concept. And the second one is the epistemic.
Of which concept?
Semantic atrophy.
Semantic atrophy, okay. But what?
Related to the concept of empowerment.
Okay.
So when you talk about empowerment, and explain why it's a semantic atrophy, but semantic atrophy refers to the overuse. When you overuse a concept, and it's lost its meaning, okay, to the point that it's losing its meaning. And the second observation was the epistemic violence, which refers to the exclusion of certain groups from participating in the creation of social meaning. So two observations: semantic atrophy and epistemic violence. So the first one, empowerment has lost its meaning because, as I said, I tried really to come up with a systematic literature review. I tried to identify, the different definitions, and there was like a plethora of definitions, multiple definitions, conceptions by different authors, scholars, depending on the fields. So for example, in economics, empowerment means mainly female labor participation, or it's measured
Mhm.
through female labor participation. In politics, it's mainly about political participation, about women's representation in government, in parliaments, in boardrooms. In sociology, it's mainly associated with the movement of feminism. So it means a lot and
Mhm.
things to different fields because it's really multidisciplinary. On the top, what makes it even more difficult, and even in the literature review, we don't have only academic literature, but also we have the gray literature, because the concept has been borrowed by international organizations and development agencies such as the UN and the World Bank, and it became associated mainly with the CEDAW and with the
Mhm.
SDGs. So the CEDAW is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and SDG 5 especially was dedicated to gender equality. So again
Mhm.
here, that's why women empowerment became synonymous of gender equality or of the CEDAW. So
Mhm.
both CEDAW and SDG 5 offered a compelling global compliance framework, and that put policymakers, specifically in the Muslim majority countries, in a political and moral dilemma. I will explain.
Oh yeah, I think it's just okay. It's still okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, okay. So I say that the CEDAW and SDG 5 became the global framework. So for policymakers in Muslim majority countries, that put them in a dilemma, in a political and moral dilemma. So whether to comply to these frameworks, which are more international liberal rights framework, and a Sharia-based legal and ethical order governing family and social relations. So they found themselves between are facing this dilemma. So this resulted in ratifying the CEDAW by the GCC countries at different stages. I think
Mhm.
the one who signed literally the latest one was Qatar. I think the first one was Kuwait, but with reservations. So they all ratified the CEDAW, but with reservations. And
Mhm.
then we have a whole chapter 3, I think, fully dedicated to this topic.
Mhm.
And it's one of the chapters that I didn't wrote. I invited Dr. Basma Abdel Ghaffar to
Yes.
write it because given her familiarity, and she's one of the expert in this field, in the Maqasid al-Sharia approach. So I
Mhm.
invite people who are interested. I give like it's a teaser, it's an appetizer for
Mhm.
those who like really to dig down to understand more. So read this chapter was dedicated because we met. She's in Canada, but she came to
Mhm.
Qatar, and then we met, we talked, and I walked her through the. So that's what the book is really like. It's knitted, like all the
Mhm.
chapters are building on each other.
Mhm.
So for this part, as I mentioned, is chapter 3 covered by Dr. Basma Abdel Ghaffar. So
Can I
yeah,
interrupt you for a second? I'm
sure,
just
yeah,
um I mean, my initial question was about, trying to get an understanding of the specific issues or the
I'm
specific characteristic of, yeah, you're getting there, I know, but I
yeah.
just for our audience. So in a sense, so you had the research project, you're going to be exploring, and was the research project entitled, or was it focused on women's empowerment in the Gulf? That was the framing of it. So then you begin to think about the lit review of women's empowerment, and as you said, you came up against these almost an epistemological as well as, I guess, an empirical challenge. The empirical challenge, and this is covered in some of the chapters, is you want to examine the actual circumstances of women in the Gulf and then try to frame that in terms of some kind of metric around empowerment. But the other aspect of it, and again, we'll keep coming back to this, is a more philosophical positioning of your conceptual framework vis-a-vis this existing framework around women's empowerment that's been developed and grown out of the West, the SDGs, CEDA, the sociological, economic, political kind of movement, and then the social movements that also grew out of that, feminist movements in the 70s. So then all of this is happening, and it's confronting a different discourse and a different framing coming out of Muslim Islamic societies. Okay, all right.
Exactly. So this is exactly this is this, if we want to say this dichotomy, or there's like a conceptual differences, ontological
Yeah.
differences, that I try to demystify and try to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like these two observations, as I mentioned, the semantic atrophy
Mm-hmm.
and epistemic violence drove me to, rather than go into the literature and say what the literature said, I decided to go for a grounded
Okay.
theory, for give
Mm-hmm.
voice to women. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
let's put literally, and it was a big bulk of work. I literally put it, and it was like almost 1 year. I have
Mm-hmm.
like literature, so I put it aside and I start, okay, let's do it from scratch. And initially, I had 50 interviews, and the interviews were mainly specifically about the role of the public sector in empowering women, which is chapter, I think, 4. So I went for a second round of interviews, uh,
Mm-hmm.
26 women, specifically on this, asking them to define what's empowerment and what is not empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's what we explained. That's how I develop in chapter 2 the framework. But here, as I said, I'm giving the embryonic phases, how the ideas
Right.
matured, how they, and how they were developed. So as I mentioned, so the widespread and mainstream conceptions of women's empowerment were clearly generated in the West and diffused globally.
Mm-hmm.
So they are value laden and infused with the liberal ideology. Um, so women's empowerment concept suffers from economic and political instrumentalization and became part of the vocabulary of policymakers. So definitely it was developed in the West and then it was diffused. And that's where in terms of comparative public policy, it's part in goes under the borrowing strategies, or in
Mm-hmm.
the so borrowing, learning, okay, learning or emulation or
Transfer,
transfer,
diffusion. Yeah.
exactly, conversions, and also here the question, is it imposed or is it voluntary? And that's
Mm-hmm.
where the context of GCC is interesting, because we know in some countries, and that's I'm coming to, in the literature, I found some literature I could connect to, I could relate to, especially like Baltiwala and Kabir, which are very critical to the Western model.
Mm-hmm.
But the context is within India. And
Mm-hmm.
here again, India is very like contrasting with the context of GCC. So that's why was the question, why the GCC and how the GCC are dealing with this concept first, how they define it, and how they deal with it in terms of policy.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings us to the second observation. So the first, as I mentioned, semantic needs to be defined from scratch or backgrounded. And the second observation about epistemic violence related to women's empowerment in the Arab and Muslim majority context with the widespread stereotypes and essentialisms of Arab and Muslim women. So in line with Lila Abu Lughud, so there are like burning illegitimate questions arise. Do Muslim women need saving? Because really, there is, when we read this all the literature, like really there is this this as a need or as a responsibility, as a duty, as a burden of liberating women across the world. So
Mm-hmm.
liberate
Mm-hmm.
them in the West. Let's go. Let's take the movement globally and let's go and liberate these women in this part of the world, and
Mm-hmm.
especially as I mentioned, and that's why there's the stereotypes and then this essentialism of the Arab woman. And as I mentioned, Lila Abu Lughou, through her book published by, I think, Harvard, Do Muslim Women Need Saving? Also, can empowerment be imposed from outside? And most importantly, what does it mean?
Mm-hmm.
What this concept mean for women from the region themselves? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
um, so especially that, as I mentioned, GCC have their own specificities and their own opportunities and challenges, of course. So here, after all this introduction, I came to your question: what's the specificity of the Gulf compared? Because as I mentioned, even if you take, for example, in the MENA, in the North African countries, let's say
Mm-hmm.
Morocco, Tunisia, they're bounded because they have like with the grants from the World Bank and the IMF, they have these adjustment structural programs, so they need to comply, right? But in the context of the GCC, which is known as high income rentier states with distinctive social contract, they have a particular demographic structure. Their economy is tied to international migration and migrant workers, especially male, and especially before the World Cup. They have their national visions starting in the 90s and their nationalization policies. And most importantly, and we will see throughout maybe in the talk, and also it appears clearly in the book, they have a state family-centered policies. And clearly they engage, and still they engage in this state feminism, right? So I think this state the context and why the context of the GCC is particular. So in response to these observations, I started the book with the grounded definition. Chapter 2 of the concept itself, exploring its localized and contextual meaning, and then therefore and also throughout the book you can see, and more specifically in the last chapter, I adopted an epistemic healing approach. So what does it mean? So epistemic healing against the epistemic violence. So try to restore local women as legitimate producers of knowledge. So rather than just being object of study, just a unit of analysis, and talking on their behalf, let them voice these concerns, let them share their experiences, let them define on their own terms what empowerment means for them. And that's what I say. I did like qualitative research. I started, overall, there was like 75 interviews, 50 exclusively there was 17 with males in the first round and 33 with females. And then in the second round, 26 deeply focused interviews, especially on identifying, on exploring the conception and definition of empowerment. So that explains why the context-driven approach was necessary.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to that. I mean, in chapter 2 of the book, which you authored, and you referred to this already, you did sort of explore this concept of women's empowerment, and particularly the results from the surveys or the research that you did with Qatari and migrant women. But I'm particularly interested to drill down a little bit in terms of what the differences are in your conceptualization of women's empowerment from the typical kind of metrics or measurements that are out there. Again, to list some of these, there's an inequality index, a gender-related development index, a gender empowerment index, the global gender gap index. And you came back to this as well in chapter 4 when you were looking at public sector employment of women in Qatar. But to get back to just before we jump into that, to get back to this notion of epistemic violence, and you wanted to explore women's own voices, I guess, in the context of Qatar specifically, and how they view empowerment and these issues. Again, for folks that don't know very much about the region, unfortunately, I think the stereotypes kick in almost instantly. And there is this notion that women have to be saved, that women are suffering in the context of patriarchy, that they're disempowered, that they don't have voice, etc. So it's one thing for you as a researcher to go and interview 50 women or any number of women and men and different types of women and men in terms of their migrant status or their national status. But what about the voices of women directly in the policymaking process in some of these states in the Gulf? To what extent? I mean, you mentioned Her Excellency. I mean, she's obviously a very powerful voice on behalf of women as well as other policy issues in the context of Qatar. But again, maybe help our listeners understand the capacity of women in the Arab Gulf states to affect policy making, so that these voices are not just voices that are reflected in the research of one academic doing a restricted set of interviews, but to what extent is this a larger conversation within the context of the Gulf states and in Qatar particularly?
I think beside Her Excellency Lulu Al-Khatir, we have, of course, the role model, Sheikha Moza, which
Mhm.
somehow yani, is the leader in this field, like so many can relate to, and of course her daughters, and so there are many examples. So
Mhm.
really, Qatar and the region offer this kind of role models that defeats are that really are at the counterpart of this essentialism or of this
Mhm.
perception and stereotypes.
Mhm.
For from also from the interviews, from the sample of honestly, I was personally impressed because it was like a random sample. It was snowballing, but even if you go through, if you read the quotes, if you read the interviews, the sample of interviews,
Mhm.
there is a deep understanding of the context first, and also of their own ontologies. And that's what reflects, and that's what helped me actually draw the framework. So if
Mhm.
we go back, if we want really to understand what's empowerment and to answer this question, we go back to the framework, because that's the analytical, that's what helps us, that's the map actually for the book.
Mhm.
Okay?
Mhm.
That's what
Mhm.
help us understand also what are the issues with these metrics, okay, and why
Okay.
these metrics sometimes they don't reflect the reality, because
Mhm.
there is really an epistemological and ontological differences and
Mhm.
sometimes dissonance, you know.
Mhm.
So from by asking these women uh the framework and what's empowerment, because I kept, I had this multiple, you can imagine the number, and when I transcribe the interviews with all this material, what I would do with.
Mhm.
So when I went through, I assembled all this. I went to Turkey in somewhere in the literally in the mountain, and I was on my myself, and I had all these sketches and these papers and this. So I tried to define by what, how, and why, because all the
Mhm.
answers. So there was like, because it was, as I mentioned, it was not spontaneous. Women were asked and they were answering,
Mhm.
responding,
Mhm.
expressing their thoughts and their understanding, their perceptions, the experiences. So when I took this, so in terms of what, it became what's empowerment. So it's mainly about agency. So here I
Mhm.
think there's a common ground. I think that they all we agree.
Yep.
But here, the agency is the autonomy, the freedom to make decisions regarding career and life paths. So here,
Mhm.
whether to enter the workforce or prioritize the home.
Mhm.
And so here we start also to see the difference. It's not like
Mhm.
one way or one size fits all. So
Mhm.
the agency is not necessarily doesn't mean the labor force participation. It's not the
Mhm.
only path to agency. It's not the only
Mhm.
way for getting empowered, right?
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
how to be empowered? Here are the resources, okay, and the preconditions, the prerequisites. So mainly the institutional support, which in the
Mhm.
GCC is so it's clear that there's, and here we talk about the state feminism, about the
Mhm.
national the visions, about
Mhm.
the national strategies. There's
Mhm.
real like, support and institutional support, and then we will see about the family friendly policies, and the education. Another
Mhm.
thing, and like the GCC, like the 99%, 99.3, they reached any level of education, um, and family encouragements. So
Mhm.
family is a precondition, is
Mhm.
a resource. It's not seen as a hinder, but as really as a resource for empowerment. And
Mhm.
of course, the work-life balance, employment policies. So these are the resources, and they were mentioned a lot in the interviews. The third pillar is why. So okay,
Mhm.
we want empowerment, we encourage for empowerment, we give the resources for, but what's the outcome? Okay, why do we need
Mhm.
empowerment? Again, from the interviews, the main themes that came out was the enhanced quality of life, social contribution, right?
Mhm.
Raising the next generation, driving positive collective change in society. So these are
Mhm.
not purely economic metrics. So
Mm-hmm.
here there's an emphasis on the collective well-being.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there is the subjective for women.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we want to be empowered, but not at any price. At the end of the day, empowerment should lead to well-being,
Mm-hmm.
individually and collectively, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where that's the grounded, all this is grounded within the Islamic referential system and Arab Gulf sociocultural context. Because
Mm-hmm.
all this, so here we answer the what, how, why, and where. And as I mentioned, you find throughout the book, this is the framework that
Mm-hmm.
explain, this is the grounded definition of empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately here, and if you go back to the metrics, empowerment is not an end that we can
Mm-hmm.
measure, that we can
Mm-hmm.
assess at a certain
Mm-hmm.
point of time, right? It's a process. It's a
Mm-hmm.
multifaceted process that is rooted in local values, driven by agency, and enhanced by access to resources and seeking women's well-being both at the individual and collective levels. That's the definition. That's the working definition, grounded
Okay.
definition
Okay.
from the book.
I mean, we're gonna get to the policy implications of the book in a moment, but I mean, if you were to step back for a moment and just listening to what you were saying, and did a kind of mix and match, like a column of objectives coming from Western liberal, or you use the term in one of your chapters, neoliberal, frameworks about what feminist objectives would be, and you line that up with the list that you were just talking about in terms of empowerment. I mean, agency, well-being.
Family, oh
Uh,
yeah.
I'm sorry, the
Family
family.
very like core.
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think what I was going to say, where I was going was that, there's a kind of mix, there's a matching in the two lists until you get to things like, I mean, well-being, for example. I think most Western feminists would argue that a feminist agenda is also about equality and agency and well-being, but in a neutral, secular sense. And certainly not necessarily harnessed to societal well-being or some kind of societal mission. So as we go down the list, there's something that begins to change in the framing that you developed. And that was my question, I guess. Is this colored by, affected by, influenced by an Islamic perspective on the world, that there's a religious element here, even if it's not very necessarily directive or powerful, it nonetheless has an influence. And in particular, I'm interested in the emphasis on family and the role of women in the family as anchors and vital, obviously. And that's not something I think that would necessarily bubble up immediately from a more secular Western perspective on feminism. So that's where the Islamic context and the Arab context in the Gulf really begins to make a difference. It's this emphasis on societal, collective well-being that is channeled through the participation and the agency of women, but it's channeled for a wider purpose, not just as the ending or the end stop or the end point is just equality, pure and simple.
Mhm. Exactly. So this is the individualist perspective versus the more collective, the more, as I mentioned, the collective well-being, the
Yeah.
versus the subjective,
Mm-hmm.
exclusive
Mm-hmm.
well-being.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so for this paradox, or if how we need to understand the context is the key, and here in this case is the Islamic worldview, as I mentioned, because of the where, because of the context specifically. For example, an example of the related to the metrics. There is the World Bank Women Business and Law Index. Now, Qatar scores 29.4 out of 100. If we see this, what does it mean?
Yeah.
That reflects an image of restriction on women and lack of progression,
Mm-hmm.
right? And for someone who's living in Qatar and who knows exactly these role models, and this doesn't reflect the reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that raises some question about global indicators, as they seem to be biased and influenced by these neoliberal values and
Mm-hmm.
conflicts in ideologies. So judging from an outside point of view, ignoring local knowledge and local priorities might lead to such biases or to lead to biased assessments. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, one of why Qatar scored that low in two there were like questions, in related, for example, to women working in hazardous jobs, in dangerous jobs, okay,
Mm-hmm.
or women working night shifts, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so this they got 0 out of
Okay. Okay.
30 or out of 20.
Uh-huh.
They were 4 blocks or 5 blocks, and there were like
Right.
points for each.
Right.
So here, if we link it with the outcome, with the why of empowerment, which is the well-being, both individually
Mm-hmm.
and collectively, we can understand why women prefer or in the society working night shift or working in dangerous places. It's not
Mm-hmm.
fit in this
Mm-hmm.
context. So it's not,
Mm-hmm.
it's depriving women from their rights, or so it's part explained by this search for or emphasis on the well-being, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
rather than allowing women to be exploited, because that opened the door to other things, for women to be exploited, which is against, again, the whole idea of empowering women,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Another example where the metrics and the statistics might be misleading, there is the ILO data that shows a low female labor participation as a percentage of the total labor force in the GCC, and notably in Qatar. I think that's chapter 4 and chapter 7 with Melissa Langworthy.
Mm-hmm.
So it shows that if we take the data as such, it shows that there is like we call the paradox, the development
Mm-hmm.
paradox. Women are highly educated, but it's not represented in the workforce. However, when we filter for citizen women, the participation rates are high, because,
Mm-hmm.
as you know, and here we come back to the specificity of the context and the GCC, which is we mentioned the demographic imbalances, right? So we have a huge percentage of men,
Mm-hmm.
especially a migrant
Migrant
and
workers, yeah.
expats,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so when we take in a total, of course, the percentage of women is very low.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
when we compare the citizen, the local Qatari to Qatari women to Qatari male, the percentage, and same thing has been done for Kuwait and for Oman, for the GCC countries, then the picture is different,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's very important to pay attention first to the specificities, to understand this, and also that data can be misleading, and
Mm-hmm.
that we can have like skewed reporting of statistics. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why
Mm-hmm.
I'm telling my students, don't take numbers for granted. No, it's
Right,
not that
right.
that
Well, you're right. I mean,
sick or
it's important to get a handle on these empirical differences, and they're extraordinarily important. Particularly in countries like Qatar, as you know, 85% of the population is expat. I mean, that's a shock to most people if they don't know or understand that, and that's broadly speaking characteristic of most of the other GCC states as well. I mean, KSA, the Kingdom of
yes.
Saudi Arabia is different, obviously, but that's a really important, and the role of migrant labor, and particularly in a period, as you pointed out, in Qatar, where you had a lot of literally construction and building going on, and that tends to be dominated by male workers. So there's the empirical difference, but again, I come back to this really interesting conceptual difference. I mean, for example, a very mechanical perspective on equality in the workforce would argue that we must have the same number of men and women in all occupations. And if those are hazardous occupations, if they're manual labor, if they're working at night, pure or true equality would involve roughly the same number and proportions of women and men in both of those. So again, that's a very mechanistic, mechanical approach. But you're saying that there's a perspective shift here when you get to this particular region in the world where equality isn't understood that way, empowerment isn't understood that way, that the role, place, nature of women is viewed differently. That difference in view doesn't mean a denigration of equality or empowerment or well-being. It's just a different perspective on the respective roles of men and women. And I think that's quite important to underscore.
If I can I elaborate on this?
Yes, 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 yeah. And could you also, just as a footnote, I'm sorry, but you mentioned a couple of times state feminism in the context of the Arab Gulf states, and that will really strike a lot of people who don't know the region as extraordinarily strange. I mean, if you could elaborate a little bit of what state feminism means in the context of Islamic Gulf monarchies, that would be really useful. So go ahead, floor is yours.
Sure, sure. Definitely, we will we'll get you to talk about this, and especially when it comes to the recommendations, also the policy recommendations. So we need to understand again for the region, Islam is perceived as a catalyst and a bedrock for women's agency. It's part of it's in the constitution, right? It's part of the national
Mhm.
identity. Uh, and so, as I mentioned, women showed a sophisticated understanding and engagement with their faith. So rather than see it just as a burden or as I would say disabling, okay, they
Mhm.
see it as a catalyst. So based on the interviews, there was a clear emphasis on moral values. So as I mentioned, empowerment is value-laden, and here the values are justice, dignity, consultative, collaborative approach, making decision, collective well-being. It's been emphasized more and more. So rather than competitive individualism. So here,
Mhm.
as you mentioned, we have the table, like the similarities and the differences. So we can agree on the justice, on the dignity, but where and we have like some differences is in the consultative way, the shura, in the collective well-being and being complementary rather than being competitive. So
Mhm.
women stress the importance of family cohesion, complementarity, and cooperation in the relationship, rather than
Mhm.
emphasis on individual autonomy, which challenged the individualistic logic of modernization. I think that's the key difference, conceptual difference of
Mhm.
philosophical
Mhm.
difference. So the sanctity of motherhood, the centrality of family are constant themes, or they were really recurrent themes in the interviews. Many women consciously and explicitly made the decision, some of them because, again, why the sample had working and not working or staying at home
Mhm.
women. Because again, if you go to the agency, how they define the agency, because sometimes if we define empowerment by labor force participation, this is very reductive, as if
Mhm.
those who are not working are not empowered, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So women consciously and made the decision to be stay-at-home mothers or strongly advocate for family-friendly policies in workplaces. So they were clear about it. Like
Mhm.
they need to have the choice, okay, on both sides, not to be imposed, not to have to work, that the work
Mhm.
shouldn't be imposed on them, and not to
Mhm.
have to stay at home, right? So in both
Mhm.
cases, that's again related to agency, right? So we
Mhm.
can have working women which is not empowered and can have, and vice versa.
Mhm.
While we have this linear or not working women are not empowered and the patriarchy and all of these things. So we jump to this conclusion.
Mhm.
While women, they say, okay, hey, for example, there were many women with a PhD. There was, I think, a woman to have two PhDs and who
Yeah.
stays at home. So again, that's the part of the part of agency.
Mhm.
Um, so there is a critical conceptual difference between Western conception of empowerment through the pursuit of literal equality. And here we come to your question. So the perception of empowering gender equality is about literal metrics, like really 50-50. You know, in
Yeah.
some reports, I found, for example, in some, like they would say, for example, in some representation, women represent 45% only.
Uh-huh.
45%, come on. But it should like be like 50-50, you know?
Exactly.
So So this is different than the equality under the Islamic ideal of justice. And if you go back to the definition of empowerment and in the chapter 2,
Hmm.
interestingly, and as I say how I came up with this framework, I took all these definitions, all these words, all these themes, and then I classified them. I see the frequency. And interestingly, there was this justice. Okay, justice that came as an important factor. Is no point. Yeah, they talked about equality, but more about justice.
Justice.
Literal equality demands identical treatment across all domains, forcing women to
Hmm.
compete under identical economic expectations. And
Hmm.
that's where some saw it as unjust.
Hmm.
So ignores physiological realities and social roles. Therefore, justice is more it encompasses more, right,
Hmm.
than equality. It
Hmm.
acknowledges inherent differences between men and women and respect their different roles. So here the demand is for fairness, which
Hmm.
accounts for difference, not for sameness. Okay, I think
Hmm.
here the key note, the key difference. So rather
Hmm.
than gender equality 50-50, and as I mentioned in this World Bank law or business law index, even the questions are stated in terms of, does women have the right to do same than men? Does
Hmm.
women do the same, that is real, so this sameness
Hmm.
rather than fairness, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So this
Hmm.
provides a layered understanding of equality that than demanding identical roles.
Hmm.
And I think here one of the important
So how does
points.
this get reflected in policy frameworks? So the policy framework of state feminism in the Gulf states and maybe in Qatar particularly. Could you comment on that? I mean, how is,
Yes.
from an official policy perspective, how is women's empowerment framed in policy terms by governments? And again, in one of your chapters, I think it's chapter 7, you do a very good job of going through the national visions and the frameworks and the development strategies. So I think that's important for people to understand. And secondly, I guess it's a three-part question. So that what's the current state of state feminism? What does it mean in the context of the Gulf? Number two, what are the current policy frameworks specifically in terms of maternity leave, in terms of childcare in the workplace, things of this nature, equal pay. I mean, those are things that would be of interest to people that are looking at gender equality. And then thirdly, and that's probably where we're gonna go for the closing of this conversation. What's the policy agenda as you see? What are the policy recommendations that come from the book? So what's state feminism, the framing? What does that mean in terms of current policy frameworks? And then what's the agenda coming out of your book in terms of the horizon of continued work in the field?
Okay. So maybe before there's a question related also to the specificities of the GCC, but not only
Okay.
because it's related.
Oh,
It's related to the state feminism,
okay. Okay.
and
Sure. Sure.
honestly, I wouldn't like to be in the shoes of the decision makers here. Uh, because really it's a dilemma, right? Because as
Hmm.
I mentioned, they are under huge pressures from global pressures to abide, to commit to, to these global standards,
Yeah.
especially with the CETA, with this SDG 5. And on the other side, they are dealing with reality, with the local reality that is
Hmm.
different than other
Hmm.
countries.
Hmm.
So one of the issues and the problems is the fertility rates, right?
Yeah. I wanted to get to
So
that. Yeah, the demographics. Yeah.
exactly. So that's why I
Mm.
say I will link it to and why the state feminism is really not a panacea. For it just translates, as I said, this dilemma that policymakers have to promote empowerment,
Hmm.
encourage women to enter the labor force participation, because there are metrics, and as I mentioned, there are classifications, and then when you see Qatar ranking low
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
this law, so countries, they try to also to look good,
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
part of branding,
Right.
and that's where
Right.
feminism come, right? So
Hmm.
the states are all the GCC countries are fully committed to promoting women's empowerment through their education. So that's why we have one of the highest rate of
Yeah.
education.
Yeah.
They encourage them to enter the labor force, and that's why, as I said, my initial work was on the role of public sector in empowering women. And we know that 92% of the work is provided by the public sector.
Hmm.
Uh, on the top, as you mentioned, we have all these family-friendly policies, and which are really very, very generous. And
Hmm.
that's what we compare with other countries, and that's all go under state feminism.
Yeah.
That states are heavily involved in empowering women by complying to these metrics, to this understand this is the definition of empowerment by global institutions and global standards, and that where the
Hmm.
policy borrowing comes, right?
Hmm.
And at the same time, we are facing a reality. On the
Hmm.
top of the small percentage we mentioned on the demographic imbalances, you have a decline in the fertility. We have a high rate of the divorce, and you
Hmm.
have marriage,
Hmm.
right? So then how you can combine? Of course,
Hmm.
there's not like clear correlation between women working and all these elements, but definitely also it appeared clearly in the interviews. One of the obstacles is the work-life balance.
Yeah.
Well, women, when they cannot balance, they give priority either to their work, their career over their family, or vice
Hmm.
versa.
Hmm.
Uh, so I'm currently working on a paper exploring, more specifically this topic, on the GCC, but definitely female labor participation across the GCC witnessed sharp increases. Meanwhile, average fertility rate declined
I've been going
below
down.
below replacement levels.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. You're
I mean,
down to under
I mean,
two, right?
I mean,
One
in
point six or something.
India, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe in other contexts, it's not alarming as it
Yeah.
is in the GCC, given
Mm-hmm.
again the understanding of the context,
Hmm.
right? So
Again, for people that don't understand the demographic contours of the Gulf states, particularly Qatar, you're dealing with a national population of Qataris somewhere in the vicinity. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, it's something in the vicinity of about 400,000. Men, women, and children that are Qatari nationals out of a population of just
14% or 15%.
yeah, 14%. But when you're talking about numbers at that level, if you have a decline in the fertility rate for a national population that's under 500,000, I mean that national population can disappear literally quite quickly because of the way in which the declining fertility rate compounds. So it's a much bigger issue for those smaller states with their smaller national populations. Which brings me quickly before we get to the remaining kind of policy questions. Migrant women. I mean, you touch on this in various chapters and in some of your interviews as well. But migrant women are a they're women, but they're a different category of women in the context of the Gulf states, partly because of obviously the numbers, their concentration in areas like the service industries, hospitality, tourism. They're not concentrated in manual labor. That's where the male population dominates. But do you have any observations about empowerment, women's empowerment in the context of the Gulf with respect to migrant women particularly?
Yeah, so that brings us to the intersectionality within empowerment. But
Hmm.
honestly, in this book, as you mentioned, it was also one of the limitations I mentioned, and that's why I'm currently working
Yeah,
on a paper exactly to explore this. Uh,
perfect.
so I didn't
Perfect.
I was aware of, but I didn't touch much to it because the emphasis was on local women. Because as I mentioned,
Right.
the grant was
Okay.
for how the public sector is empowering local or Qatari women. So the emphasis was on women,
Hmm.
but as the sample has a representation from migrant women, and I think also is in the book and one of the recommendations, by the way, because also one of the deliverables was a policy brief that went to the government and also that
Okay.
in the Shura that was presented to the Shura Council. So
Mhm.
there was observation, one observation is the social exclusion. There's clearly
Mhm.
a social exclusion of this category of actually men and women, migrants, whether they're men or, but since we're talking about women empowerment, there is
Yeah.
exclusion of women within even the public sector, or especially in the public sector, as I mentioned, because
Mhm.
the focus was mainly on the public sector. So therefore, the recommendations were to be more inclusive, or to adopt, to
Mhm.
have policies that are more inclusive. And as I mentioned, that was one of the recommendation drafted in the policy brief. So to include migrant women in the policies seeking women's empowerment and work-life balance as well. Okay.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's also if you have to talk about the currently there was like after, since the book has been published, a lot of policies. I mean, they went to the implementation, about flexible hours and
Mhm.
or I mean, family friendly policies. But again, that doesn't include migrant or expat
Migrant,
women.
yeah, yeah. Again, that's a very specific feature and a very powerfully important demographic feature of these Gulf states that wouldn't be replicated almost anywhere else in the world. Just this massive imbalance between the migrant population or the expat population and the national population. And that would take us down too many rabbit holes, I think, in terms of issues of, I mean, if you're talking about empowerment and participation, there's no path to citizenship, for example, in the context of for migrant labor. I mean, they're expat workers. You could get everything in terms of equality of wages, maybe even certain some kinds of employment support services, etc. Equal treatment, fair pay, but they're all focused on the workplace. I mean, there's no capacity for political participation on the part of migrant workers because they can never have a path to citizenship. But that's a whole other area of discussion in this
That's again
particular context.
part of the structure, or the specifics of the Gulf, the stratification,
Yeah,
social and
exactly.
political,
Yeah, yeah,
civic
yeah,
stratifications. Yeah, but again, it's
yeah.
part of the contract. Like, this is the social contract of this country.
Exactly. Yeah. So in closing, a couple of questions, but to get back to the policy agenda. So what are the policy recommendations that came out of the book? And of course, the book now, it's a couple of years old. Has there been any progress on that policy front? As you mentioned, you made recommendations through policy briefs based on the research in the book. So what are the recommendations that came out of the book, and what kind of traction has there been in terms of policy changes in the Gulf states?
So as I mentioned, the changes are more focused toward implement, because there's an alarming there's an emergency, in terms of demography, and so
Mm,
the policymaker is fully aware of this. So that's why there was, like, in 2024 a family charter. First, like 2 years, there was the creation of this ministry, which was not there. The family labor, not labor development, social family affairs.
okay.
Okay, with a minister, a woman who was here in the Doha Institute. Now, Dr. Mariam El Misnet, who
Mm-hmm.
became
Mm-hmm.
Minister for Foreign Affairs. So again,
Mm-hmm.
you see here the empowerment. So we have a
Yes.
lot of
Yeah.
examples. So this was established in 2024. And also the third National Development Strategy 2024 also is explicitly identifies, I quote, building a cohesive society that maintains its authentic values and strong family ties as a central objective, and commits to build and strengthen strong families by expanding policies that support childbearing and marriage and increase women's ability to enter the workforce. So
Oh,
again,
for
here,
both.
exactly. So that's why they're really like this balance. They're
Right.
trying to keep, they're aware of the issue,
Uh-huh.
okay, of demographic and of
Mm-hmm.
urgency. But in the same time, they have this global compliance, and that they
Mm-hmm.
have. So this they're navigating. They need to. That's why I say it's really like to put yourself on the shoes of the policymakers. It's not an easy one.
Mm-hmm.
because you have to deal with all this, first understand, have this map, this global map, and really carefully. It's literally like you need to cater for all these pressures. So that's why the chapters 9 or 7 with Melissa Langworthy, the title was through the eye of the needle.
Yes, yes.
So that's
Mm-hmm.
really the situation. Like
Mm-hmm.
imagine like getting through the eye of the needle. So they
Uh-huh.
really need to navigate this. So the conclude, I mean the takeaway or the main global recommendation, policy recommendation, is to have a locally anchored blueprint, because no one
Mm-hmm.
would understand the context better than the people themselves. And
Mm-hmm.
here comes the epistemic healing.
Mm-hmm.
So policy learning over emulation. Emulation, copy and paste is not a solution.
Mm-hmm.
It's not sustainable. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely not sustainable. And also, I think the effort should be made both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Global institutions also need to be aware. One size
Mm-hmm.
fits all cannot work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
Mm-hmm.
as I mentioned, like 45 only on women empowered, it can be it can be applied,
Mm-hmm.
in as we mentioned, like literally and
Mm-hmm.
cross border to all
Mm-hmm.
countries. So stop or avoid copy and pasting global metrics. Develop regional indicators that measure holistic well-being. So as we defined empowerment based on the context, we need also to develop metrics
Mm-hmm.
that capture,
Mm-hmm.
this empowerment rather than just copy and paste and just getting in this ranking and who's best, and we came to this token, and but at the end of the day, again, is it really, are we serving women? No.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And process, because it's a process. It's not as we imagine. It's not an end in itself. It's not static. It's a process. Even if we reach the 50-50, if we give women this high position, if we have 50 minister, if you have 50 director, if we have, but at the end of the day, women, they don't have this well-being. Okay. Women they are burned out. They cannot handle, they have this double burden, this triple burden.
Mm-hmm.
And even at the personal level, the personal, the individual being and the collective being is put in hazardous or in jeopardy. They're jeopardizing their well-being
Mm-hmm.
and society. Then what's for with the empowerment? We have numbers, but
Mm-hmm.
in fact, really, and again, and that's personally applied in my life, because it's helped me a lot. That's the good thing to doing research that relates to, it's not like only empirical, I mean, theoretical and philosophical. And myself, as head of department, as director of programs, so the question, to which extent this is empowerment, especially related to agency? Do I have
Mm-hmm.
full capacity to make a decision? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And at the end, do I have this well-being that offer me this quality of life? And most
Mm-hmm.
of all, am I contributing the way I would
Mm-hmm.
like? And where's the
Mm-hmm.
impact? Am I doing impact, or I'm just fulfilling a position, right?
Mm-hmm.
So policy learning over emulation. Second one, protect the ecosystem. So expand family-friendly public policies that view motherhood and career as complementary, not competing. And as I mentioned here, the government here is fully aware of this. So that's why there are these policies that offer, they start implementing actually since last year. There's flexible working hours and
Mm-hmm.
part-time
Okay.
jobs. And the third, globally, and I'm re-summarizing,
Mm-hmm.
center the voices. So center the voices rather than have these noises. We
Mm-hmm.
need to center the voices to hear locally. Again, this stop the epistemic violence, activate the epistemic healing.
Mm-hmm.
So engaging, recognizing Arab Muslim women as producers of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, base future legislative framework on the actual qualitative aspiration of Gulf women anchored in the dignity, justice of Islamic worldview. Because also this word dignity, karama, dignity comes a lot. So again, having women in positions but losing their dignity is not empowering. Uh, uh, so I think that's the main takeaways.
That's a wonderful ending. I was going to ask you some technical questions about future research directions, but I think that would uh, dissipate the powerful points that you were just making about both the linkage between your research that you're doing, the policy developments at the level of the country, and also, how research can affect one's own personal perspective. So I'm going to close it there. I think those were very stirring words, and effectively provide a sense of what the emerging research directions will be for you. So thank you very much. It's been a wonderful conversation as always, and terrific research. And congratulations to you and your colleagues for the production of the book, and for future directions and future impact, as well as personal development and well-being. So thank you very much, and stay safe under these kinds of contexts and circumstances.
Thank you. My pleasure. It's my pleasure. And as I mentioned, it's what like teasers and appetizers for people. It's open access, so if they can
Yeah.
read the book, and I'm open to any further conversation. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much again. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.